Welcome to today's webinar on personal protective equipment, also known as PPE. And this will be a head-to-toe review on PPE presented by the Motor Safety Association. You may have noticed that your microphones have been muted, and we do this to minimize background noise. But I encourage you, if you do have any questions, to please enter them in the question box either throughout the webinar or at the end of the webinar. And once they've been concluded, I will review all questions and answers and send them out to the webinar attendees today. So on our agenda, I'll go through an introduction to personal protective equipment. I'll speak to the hierarchy of controls when it comes to determining PPE selection, and go over tips for the different types of PPE, and conclude with a review of what we covered in this webinar. Personal protective equipment comes with directions. Whether it be a pair of safety glasses, a hard hat, or hearing protection, either in the package or a part of the package, there are directions. And these directions explain how to use, store, and maintain personal protective equipment. And one that sticks out specifically to me is when I look at disposable earplugs. On those packages, there's pictures and clear step-by-step directions on how to use disposable hearing protection. But sometimes we still see it not installed correctly. So we're hoping that today's webinar will give you some supplemental information to further your personal protective equipment program at your facility. So PPE is equipment worn by a worker to minimize exposure to specific hazards. So the PPE is designed to be that last line of defense to protect the workers from hazards. However, using personal protective equipment is only one element in the hazard control program, because what are other strategies that we can look at to maintain a health and safety environment? When we are assessing our hazards at our facilities, we can determine what items can hurt us and how we can protect ourselves from harm. And that's essential when it comes to health and safety. But a lot of concerns when it comes to personal protective equipment is people might feel that when they're wearing PPE, they are in fact protected solely from that hazard. But PPE does nothing to reduce the hazard itself, nor does it guarantee permanent or total protection. And let me explain that. If we were sitting together in our service facility and we have an air compressor that's putting out 100 decibels of noise, and if I asked workers to wear hearing protection, I have not done anything to address that hazard right at the source. So just relying on hearing protection to keep my workers safe is part of the control, but dealing with that item at the source is more important. And we'll touch on that hierarchy of controls shortly. So when do we need to wear personal protective equipment? Remember, the hazard is not eliminated when PPE is used. However, the risk or probability of the injury may be reduced. So when do we need to wear personal protective equipment? In some situations, it may only be an interim measure until we can implement long-term controls. So until we relocate that air compressor, we're going to need to wear hearing protection. Or in some situations, other controls may not be available or adequate. So in fact, we may need to address those concerns and to eliminate them so that PPE, in fact, will be the requirement. So keeping that in mind, if we cannot control the hazards at the source, we may need to go to personal protective equipment. Or you might need to use it for maintenance or emergent situations for cleanups. So PPE would be used under one of these categories. So it could either be a short-term measure or if you cannot control the hazards adequately, or during maintenance or emergency situations. And as I spoke about eliminating the hazard, that is our first choice because this method will eliminate it from the workplace altogether. The approach may also require substitution. Maybe we can substitute a quieter air compressor that puts out less decibels in this example when we are procuring or purchasing equipment. Or we may have a barrier that isolates the sound from the worker. So those are other ways of dealing with that hazard. And as we move down the triangle, there's administrative controls such as safe work practices, education and training sessions, all play a matter in controlling those types of hazards at the source. But the bottom of our triangle is where the PPE is, and that's when the hazard cannot be removed or controlled adequately, is when we rely on that personal protective equipment, because it's the last line of defense. However, in some situations, I see people starting here with the personal protective equipment. And let's just provide some hearing protection and safety glasses, but maybe we're not taking a whole look at some of these other areas of where we can eliminate or substitute that hazard instead of relying solely on PPE. So I encourage you to keep that theme in mind when we are speaking about personal protective equipment. Can we eliminate it so that the hazard so that we're not solely relying on that PPE to keep us safe? Once that we've made the determination that personal protective equipment is required, we need to select what type of PPE we need at our facility. And by doing that, we may need to conduct a hazard or risk assessment to determine what types of hazards are present and determination for the PPE requirements. We may also look to our safety data sheets because that will indicate certain personal protective equipment requirements. But if I was a worker, I could ask my supervisor, what kind of personal protective equipment do I need to use? It is the supervisor's responsibility to provide the personal protective equipment to the worker and inform them of their PPE requirements. And if the supervisor isn't sure, the supervisor can discuss with their supplier the correct PPE requirements. And that's going to be not a bit of a theme of today's webinar is having your PPE supplier as a good contact, because this is someone that you will likely need to rely on to determine PPE requirements for recommendations. These people are the experts on the products, and they can in fact point you to the correct selection of personal protective equipment. And a lot of times suppliers have different resources available to them, such as training programs on how to use, store, and maintain the personal protective equipment. Some tips when you are purchasing PPE, ensure that it meets an approved standard. That means, has it been tested against a standard for quality and durability? If it doesn't have a CSA approval or ANSI or there are other certifying standards out there logoed on the product or the packaging, do not purchase it, because I wouldn't trust my eyes to a product that hasn't been tested to an approved standard. So keep that in mind when you are purchasing PPE. And also ensure that when you are selecting PPE, you take a look at the whole process. If I'm purchasing different types of respirators every other year for my staff, how do I know that they fit? Because they need to fit my worker, and if they were fit tested to a respirator from one type of company and I purchased it from another type of company the following year, they're going to be different. So we have to have some consistency. So when we are selecting PPE, that it fits us properly and that we know how to maintain and inspect it. And again, follow those directions that come with your personal protective equipment for the usage, storage, and maintenance. I'm going to go through some of those tips in the following slides to give you some of that information on how to use, store, and maintain your personal protective equipment. But what I would like to mention is the Motor Safety Association does not promote or endorse any specific supplier of personal protective equipment. I encourage today's webinar attendees to seek out a supplier that has the products that they need, that they wish to work with at their dealerships or facilities. And truly, there are so many different types of PPE. Each type of personal protective equipment that I'm going to go through could truly be its own webinar or course topic on its own. And again, I like to mention that the PPE that will be featured in the next coming slides is the last line of defense. Always remember the hierarchy of controls and how can we deal with that hazard at the source before relying on the PPE to keep our workers safe. So let's start at the top and talk about hard hats. To use a hard hat, you would put it on your head and adjust the knob on the back of the suspension to ensure a snug fit. You'll need to store your hard hat out of extreme temperatures. And when it comes to maintenance, do not cover your hard hats with stickers, decals, or write on it with markers, because you cannot inspect it for damages and see if there are any cracks or any type of those concealed damages. And that tells me that a lot of people aren't reviewing the directions that come with their PPE, because I see a lot of hard hats with decals and stickers on them. When it comes to maintaining your hard hat, underneath the lid of the hard hat, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, you'll see a date code. And this one particularly in the picture was molded on July 7th, 2001. So we see the 01 for the first year, the 7th month, and the 7th day. So take a look at your hard hat to see when it was molded, and check that with your supplier. From my research, most manufacturers suggest approximately a 5-year hard hat replacement guideline, and the suspension is generally 2 to 3 years. That's the undercarriage that goes on your head beneath your hard hat. But again, check with your supplier to see what sort of time frame they put on their hard hats for replacement. Also, we have bump caps, and this is something you would put on your head, whether it be in the type of a cap, and you adjust the strap for a secure fit. And actually, just recently, I'd seen someone who was wearing this underneath their toque in a winter type of environment that we have here in Saskatchewan. So bump caps are good in our industry. When people are working around equipment, if they could bump their head, those types of objects, you're going to get some protection from a bump cap. Bump caps aren't good for working under cranes or overhead hazards because they don't provide you any type of impact protection from falling objects. And when we are storing our bump caps, a lot of these types of products, to keep them stored in clean environments away from extreme temperatures. Next up, we have our face shields. They would fit the same way that a hard hat would. You put it over your head and adjust the knob on the strap to obtain a secure fit. When you are storing it, you would store it in a clean environment, and if you were to clean the visor, ensure that you use a cloth that won't scratch the visor shields in order to minimize damage to it. But face shields do provide optimum coverage for impacts to the face, and it protects workers from different flying types of objects that could happen at various locations. So those debris, flying objects, particles, those types of things that can make contact with the face, those types of visors and face shields work well. And in some situations, people will also wear safety glasses under the face shields for best protection. And when we have safety glasses, we need to ensure that we adjust the straps of the safety glasses to get a snug fit to our face so that the glasses aren't falling down our nose or that they're fitting loosely on our face. We should have that adequate protection so that it's a good seal very close around the face so that we get that optimum protection. Storing safety glasses, again, should be done in a clean environment. And if you to maintain them, again, that soft cloth to keep our visors or lenses free from scratches. But if they are damaged or broken, do not attempt to replace them. I've seen people wearing damaged glasses, throw those out, and there are other types of, a lot of safety glasses out on the market. There used to be concerns that safety glasses would be fogging up, and people had concerns around that. But the engineering that's went into these products have really deemed out a lot of those concerns. So safety glasses now, you can get ones that will not fog up, which work great. So it eliminates that excuse that we've heard in the past. And it really is unfortunate. There are people suffering from preventable eye injuries every year, whether it be from flying objects or sparks, different types of particles. And unfortunately, most workers have never received any type of eye protection training. This actually is shameless advertising for motor safety because on our website we have a course for our members on hand, eye, and back protection. So I encourage you to enroll your staff members in that course because it's going to provide them with some prevention tips on keeping their hand, eyes, and back safe. Hearing protection. So how do I know what type of hearing protection is required at my facility? Have I ever had noise sampling or long-term doses measured of our noise levels at our facility? We have two different types of devices for this. We use one type of meter that will record decibels at the point of the worker. So if they're using tools such as shop vacuum, pressure washer, impact wrenches, we can do a sample right at the worker's level. And then we also have a long-term dose meter, which provides us with that 8-hour sample. And that's something the worker would wear in their pocket, which would give us that Lex value of the exposure level for the worker. And sometimes I find quite interesting, especially in detailing areas of automotive or agricultural, those types of businesses, people who are running pressure washers and shop vacuums, they're exposed to levels of noise from the pressure washer and vacuum for long periods of time. And because these decibels may not seem as loud as what an impact wrench would be, sometimes people have missed out that hearing protection should be worn in those types of environments. So that's something, it's good to get those noise levels tested to give you that starting point to help you determine your requirements for PPE. And when you're seeking out your hearing protection, it would have an NRR rating, which stands for noise reduction rating. And this is the maximum protection that could be achieved if the hearing protection is worn perfectly and correctly. But however, in most situations, it's not worn correctly, and that NRR rating is cut down to half. So if I'm looking at PPE with an NRR rating of 30, it's realistically going to block out at least 15 decibels of noise because sometimes people aren't wearing their PPE correctly. So how do we wear our PPE correctly when it comes to hearing protection? If I have ear muffs, they would go over my ears to fully enclose my ear and provide a tight seal on my head. And you can adjust the band on your ear muffs to ensure that you have the right distance so that those muffs cover your ears correctly. There's also what's called canal caps, and if you can see where my mouse is here, they rely on basically the tension of the band to hold the little tips into place. And we see a lot of people who use muffs or canal caps or disposable plugs. And the disposable plugs need to be rolled before inserted into the ear. And again, looking at the directions right on the package, it shows you how to pull the tip of your ear up while you roll the plug with your other hand and insert the plug until it fills and expands in your ear, and then you would release. And this again is just something sometimes people miss, because I see hearing protection in the form of disposable plugs hanging out of the ears, not providing that adequate protection. When it comes to maintenance, cleaning the muffs as per manufacturer's directions, the canal caps, do not be afraid to change the tips on these. A lot of times I see these are black, and that can cause other damage to our ears by ways of infections. So be sure to change the tips on your canal cap type of earplugs. And if you have disposable plugs, please do not reuse them. They are disposable. Next, I'll touch on respiratory protection. And in respiratory protection, there are three basic categories, whether we're protecting from particulates, gases and vapors, or oxygen deficient atmospheres. So in order to determine the respirator needed, we need to know what the workers are exposed to and the types of hazards at their workplaces. So looking at a hazard assessment will give us this information. Safety data sheets will also indicate the requirement for respirators, but a lot of times they may not spell out what type of respirator to use. So that's when we have that good relationship with our supplier, where we call them and determine what our hazards are, and they make the recommendation for the correct type of respirator to use. When you are using a respirator, again, ensure it's correct for the task at hand and that it fits properly. It is a standard through the CSA to have respirator fit testing completed every 2 years. So if I were to have workers using an N95 type of disposable respirator, and if they're working with different particulate at their facility, how do I know what size they need, or even what type of N95 to use, unless they've been fitted to a specific size and brand? So keep that in mind, because respirators do leak, and they can bypass around the nose or in the chin area on those disposables if they're not fit properly to the person. And when we are looking at storing the respirators, so some of the other types of respirators with the cartridges on them, store them in a sealed plastic bag. This keeps the respirator clean, and it also helps keep the cartridges from being spent and using their useful life expectancy up. So store those in a sealed type of plastic bag. And pay attention to some of the replacement cartridges. They have service life indicators on them, which will tell you when they need replacement. And again, this is a topic its own that could be a whole webinar when it comes to respiratory protection. But just to reiterate, know what hazards workers are exposed to, check the safety data sheet, do the hazard assessment, again, work with the supplier to determine the correct respirator and ensure that it fits the worker. Next, we have high visibility vests. And basically to wear these, you put it on, do up the zipper. There's Velcro straps that you can use to adjust the size. And they do come in different sizes, small, medium, large, XL, etc. But try to get the one closest fit to you, and you can adjust those Velcro straps to make it a little bit of a better fit. But starting with the closest size to your natural size is the best practice. When you maintain high visibility vests, follow the supplier's washing directions. And when these high visibility vests are either faded or permanently stained, they're no longer effective. And again, this is one of the items I think of when we're talking about the hierarchy of controls, because earlier we talked about how can we engineer the hazard out at the source. So using a high visibility vest is part of the solution, but so is using a designated signaler, traffic control plan, routes in our parking lot, speed limits. These are all ways of dealing with vehicular traffic at the source, opposed to just wearing a high visibility vest. So the vest is part of the picture, but there is more to it. And if you're exposed to that vehicular traffic, some people have incorporated high visibility into their coveralls from their suppliers. So if you are exposed to vehicular traffic, which I'm guessing pretty much everyone in our industry is, if there's powered mobile equipment such as forklifts, trucks, tractors, sprayers, service vehicles, any types of vehicular traffic, whether you're a salesman in the parking lot or a parts person going into the warehouse or a service tech, if there's types of vehicular exposure, those high visibility garments are required. And as I said, people have incorporated them right into their coveralls. But when you're using coveralls, just be aware of the work being completed. If you are doing hot work, fire retardant coveralls are a requirement. So just be certain what you are working with to determine the correct coveralls that you need for that task. And be sure that your coveralls fit properly. If they're too big, they're a hazard. Do not cut the sleeves off or make them into shorts, and know when to replace them when they do turn into a hazard. As far as maintenance, clean them as per supplier's recommendations. Fall protection harness. So if you do work at heights, the protection harness, ensure that it fits you correctly. And not only that, have you taken a fall protection, fall arrest course? Is there a rescue plan? So I need to know this before I'm going to put on a harness. How am I going to get down from there if I fall? And sometimes that's overlooked. We supply harnesses. People may have taken a course on fall protection. But what about the rescue plan? How am I going to get down? If the fall didn't kill me, I may die stuck in that harness until someone rescues me. So that's part of the fall protection program. But as we look at the harnesses, you want to store them in clean environments and maintain them so that they're clean, and ensure that the labels are clearly visible, and to look for any types of damages when you are inspecting your equipment. And contact that supplier because they can fix you up with the correct size of harness that you need, and ensuring that you are using that appropriately. Some suppliers do offer fall protection and fall awareness courses. On our website, we have a fall protection and fall arrest free webinar, which will give you some tips on this topic. When we are using gloves, again, the supplier can help you determine the correct glove usage for the application at your facility. And sizing is also critical. If I'm needing a medium glove and I'm wearing large, that can be a hazard as well. So the wrong size of glove can be problematic. Gloves are sometimes one of the most overlooked PPE items that are not worn because people, they get burns on their hands, cuts, punctures, abrasions, and the glove technology has really come a long ways. We see gloves protecting for vibration and different types of chemical hazards and for punctures. So the engineering that's went into these products have made them a lot more comfortable for technicians to wear and still providing a lot of great protection. So again, reach out to your supplier. Sometimes they can bring you out different samples to see what in fact will work for you at your facility and make a decision based on the hazards present. Maintaining gloves, if they are damaged or they have holes in them, excessively dirty or greasy, they need to be replaced because then they have become a hazard. And again, as I mentioned shamelessly, we do have a hand, eye, and back online course for our members, which will provide some more information on keeping our hands safe. Kneeling pads. Basically, you slide them over your knee. They may have an elastic type band, or they may have a Velcro strap to adjust to securely keep them in place. As far as maintenance, just do a quick check on them for any damages to the knee pads. And in addition to knee pads, some people have also used kneeling pads, and those work great. The only concern with those is they're not on your knees. So if you have to go get your kneeling pad, you may not use it. But the knee pads will protect our joints from some of that shock and the discomfort that we get if we are kneeling on concrete or hard surfaces. So they work great in providing that comfort and protection to our workers. Steel toe footwear. Basically, you would lace up the boots such as this type and ensure that they are on snugly. You'd want to store them out of extreme temperatures. As far as maintenance, some types of shoes, there are protective coatings you can put on, and this helps ensure the water resistancy, which is critical when it comes to protecting us with that electrical shock protection that steel toe footwear, if they have the orange and white lettering, provides. So just ensuring that we are trying to keep our footwear dry. And you can also inspect your footwear regularly. Check for damages, whether it is cracks in the soles, breaks in the leather. If we can see the metal toe cap, that's when we have some concerns, and these types of footwear should be replaced. Or perhaps the sole may have been punctured, so the rest of the footwear looks good, but there's a puncture in the sole, and it may be a little bit harder to see. So check your footwear out. And anytime there's been an event or extreme damage to your footwear, it needs to be discarded because we cannot guarantee its protection no longer. And on our diagram here, this type of boot is common in our industry. Green triangle is what we see if it has sole protection and a steel toe cap. And the white rectangle with orange lettering indicates electrical shock protection. So this is, again, something common that we see in our industry, but again, based on your own hazards, you may have something different at your locations as well. There's also specialized personal protective equipment. And in situations, workers may require molded earplugs or bifocal type of safety glasses that have the magnifying properties of your regular glasses built into your safety type of glasses. So again, reach out to your manufacturers or suppliers if you have workers that require these types of specialized personal protective equipment. And again, to follow the maintenance directions for keeping them clean and maintained properly. So this gets us to the end of our webinar on PPE head-to-toe review. But there's going to be some sample templates for all attendees to receive. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will receive a sample PPE policy, a toolbox talk on personal protective equipment, and a hearing conservation plan. As well as all attendees will receive an educational certificate which they can use, they can insert their name into it, print it off, and save it for your records. And at the conclusion of today's webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen, which will be appreciated if it's completed because it gives us tips for future webinars of topics that you're interested in that we can present on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the webinar open briefly for another minute or two and just allow you to type in any last questions that you might have. And so I encourage you to enter those questions in now if you have not done so already. And those will be questions and answers sent back to all webinar attendees. And if you might not think of a question right now, you may have one in the future. So feel free to reach out to us by contacting us at the number provided and at the email here as well, info@motorsafety.ca. So I encourage you at this time to do so. And I will leave the webinar open. For those of you that are signing out, I thank you for taking the time to join me today in this webinar on personal protective equipment head-to-toe review. Thank you.